Thank you very much, and thanks for having me, here at Bonn, I may say, even though we're mostly all remote these days. I'm really loving what you guys are doing with the Slavery Studies Center that you have there. I think it's really exciting, and I've heard many, many good things about it. So I just wanted to say that as well. So let me just share my screen here, and I'll get into the PowerPoint presentation. As Janine mentioned, it's quite a large project. I can also add, I've just recently won a Mellon New Directions Fellowship to return to school for 3 years to continue learning GIS and other mapping platforms. So what I'm really talking about with West Africa Historical GIS is, there's usually among the general public, non-specialists in Africa, the three maps of Africa that we sort of have to begin thinking about, right? We have the modern day one, which of course we're all very familiar with, the colonial map, which some of us might be familiar with too. But as soon as we get into the era of the transatlantic slave trade, we end up having these sort of pre-colonial states that were in constant flux over many different periods of time. So my project specifically is beginning to address how we can begin to map the pre-colonial period, especially as it relates to the transatlantic slave trade. What this essentially entails, and the real complication with this, is that for internal Africa during the 19th, 18th centuries and earlier, we don't have a lot of cartographic representations that aren't from the slave trading Eurocentric perspective. So they're mainly coastal. We usually get maps like this that are very undetailed blobs of states that are sort of the representations of what the past might have looked like. So my West Africa Historical GIS really began by looking at sort of a more complex way of visualizing West Africa during the pre-colonial period. So my initial area of interest was really this period between the extent of the Oyo Empire, which was a major slave trading state, and then its collapse by 1836 and the rise of the Sokoto Caliphate. So in this before and after map, we can really begin to see sort of the geopolitical transformations that were occurring in West Africa over, a 70-year period. So just sort of a lot of the House of States, they amalgamated into one of the largest pre-colonial states in West Africa, the Sokoto Caliphate. So the problem with before and after maps is that we're only sort of looking at them again in this generalized sense. They also, while quite detailed, they lack a lot of detail. So we don't get a sense of population density. We don't get a sense of, really the extent and the number of different places that existed internally within Africa. So in 2013, I published this map of about 500 inland places in 1780, which really serve as the basis for a data set that I've been working with using QGIS, and in specifically the Time Manager plugin. So what I did is I took a lot of these towns that are referenced in the secondary literature, and then began to sort of plot them out onto annual maps where I developed a sort of a whole data system, which I'll show you in just 3 more slides. But essentially what I was able to do using QGIS was really look at sort of the before and after on a very localized scale of the collapse of the Oyo Empire. And in doing so, I was able to produce annual maps of the collapse of a kingdom over a period of time. And so what this really was about was looking at how conflict within Africa resulted in the collapse of Oyo. So if I just go back to the before and after map, what we're essentially talking about with the Sokoto Caliphate was a large series of jihads that spread into the Oyo region, along with civil war, other foreign incursions, including from Dahomey and other Yoruba groups, resulted in sort of this gradual collapse over a 20-year period of the Oyo Empire. So the data that I was collecting was actually quite simple. I have a start date and an end date. And this table represents the capital city of Oyo and its gradual abandonment in 1836 and then relocation to a different place called New Oyo today. This is the place you would find on Google Maps. You wouldn't find reference to the archaeological site of Old Oyo. So the table is really simple. You can see that there's sort of X and Y coordinates. They remain the same until the town actually relocates. Then there's sort of the toponym, which is the place of Oyo, the capital city of this former kingdom, the political affiliation that it might have been involved with as it sort of switched back and forth during different periods of conflict over this 20-year period. And then I've represented sort of a subjective conflict intensity scale, where 0 represents no conflict, 1, some conflict, 2, the destruction of a place, and then 3, its relocation. So these were essentially the core data set that was required to produce these annual maps and gradual disintegration of the kingdom. So as I began to sort of work with these data, I teamed up with the Laboratory of Interdisciplinary Statistical Analysis at my university, because I believe that looking at conflict, usually within warfare, this would be a major contributor to the enslavement of many, many people. So we began using R, and we took the data that I had generated for about 500 places inland, all of them undergoing conflict in different years, to generate these different heat maps. So you can actually toggle the year that you want to see. You can increase the population density of people. Here are the boundaries again. And then we created a Markov decision process trade matrix. So looking at sort of the key trade routes internally to different major cities that we know about because of the secondary literature. So this is sort of how we're bringing all of this information together in different ways. And that too, this is just sort of a close-up of the trade matrix that will be used to apply mathematical formulas to really understand where people might have come from conflict in a given year, and potentially what slave ship they might have boarded from an inland place. So it generates these sort of these conflict heat maps as well. So you can see the shifting conflict over annual periods of time, which become really, really helpful when we're trying to understand when and where people came from in Africa before they boarded slave ships at the coast. So we've submitted this to the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society, where we have formulas. You can access this through yorubadiaspora.org. We've sort of pre-published it in archive.org. So where I'm going with this now is really to build out West Africa Historical GIS. This is going to be a very, very slow process, but it's my belief that we can begin to tag data points, spatial data points, and begin to unpack a lot of these different migrations that were happening from West Africa and particularly to the Americas. So you can sort of see from different heat maps, this slave ship, for example, because it was occurred during the abolition movement, we actually have an image of its capture by British abolitionists, a register of all of the people on board where we can do a statistical analysis of the languages of African names. So we can understand the ethno-linguistic composition of individual slave ships. So what this essentially means is that each slave ship, we can begin to sort of associate the different evidence that comes with a particular ship. So we can create a digital archive and put it into this cartographically based representation. If you look at a different year, you get different configurations of people depending on the port that they're leaving from. And this is mostly because of all of the records that we have from the abolition movement. We'll also be able to tie in archaeological data, 3D representations of archaeological findings and evidence, as well as sort of multimedia that might be related to oral traditions about particular places as well. So the sort of tying in these digital archives into cartographic representations that operate on a temporal axis are really sort of the way in which I'm envisioning this larger project. So we have a lot of information about this migration that continues on over into the Americas, where we have different warfare of the enslaved people who were brought from this period. So we'll be able to figure out, where these people might have originated from with greater degrees of probability, which should have huge implications for African ancestry in the Americas. Here is just some other representations of the continuation of warfare from this region in Brazil. So this is the Mali uprising in Bahia in 1835. Again, we have lists of people, amulets of Arabic origin that are part of the documentation in Brazil. So the project really extends to the Americas as we begin to sort of unravel these internal migrations. So one of the things that I'm also exploring is how we begin to talk about data, because we're essentially talking about data in terms of enslaved people. But what I'm essentially aiming on doing here is regenerating some of these digital identities of enslaved people. And I think that combination between the computational terms and the humanities is something that we have to become increasingly aware of in the digital humanities, because we don't want to be labeling, numbering people as data, putting them into data buckets or other sort of things as well. So I just want to clarify, if I'm talking about digital identities, I'm really talking about the representations of these people in digital forms. So a lot of this information too, these are actual images of the people who, and photographs of people who were involved in the migrations of the Yoruba diaspora. So again, it's being able to organize large amounts of information, look at changes over time, geographically, spatially, and statistically as well. Another project that I've been working as I want to expand this out beyond the region is I teamed up with several scholars in my field of African history, and we re-regionalized the entire continent through consultations with well over 40 different scholars. We did this in part because of Voyages, the transatlantic slave trade database, which uses regions that are colonial terms, slave trading terms, and we needed something better to be able to organize all of these digital identities on a regional basis, since that's usually what we only have. This will help with the building of West Africa Historical GIS, because I can systematically go by region to expand the data set and begin to tie in different types of information. The key set of information that I've already begun alluding to relates to the Liberated Africans project, which is another digital project I run that really relates to all of those registers of people from slave ships. So I've been organizing that over periods of time too. In total, I've come across about 225,000 liberated Africans, which I'll explain in a little more detail, because this is very fundamental to understanding these migrations as well, since they involve the registers of people removed from slave ships, which is the most detailed information we have. So this is just sort of the regional breakdown of where liberated Africans originated from within Africa along the coast. So this Western Bight region, or the Bight of Benin, that's essentially the Yoruba diaspora. So I'm working through interpreting over 30,000 African names using different dictionaries of African names that are out there. So we'll be able to sort of unpack those statistics as well. The Liberated Africans movement, the age of abolition, this really sort of hinges on the British abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and the formation of the West Africa Squadron, where they went out and captured slave ships, brought them into courts of vice admiralty, particularly at Freetown, but other places in the Caribbean, Brazil, and along the east coast of Africa as well. This resulted in these judicial processes, the signing of bilateral treaties with various European slave trading nations, and the making of these registers of liberated Africans as well, where they transcribed and transliterated a lot of African names which we're now using for analysis. So in terms of West Africa GIS, there's a lot of data that we can begin to layer onto temporal maps of Africa and the conflicts that's associated with them. So we can layer, not only slave ship departures or shifting conflict over time, but also some of the legislation that was occurring around the Atlantic world during this period. So the anti-slave trade legislation have organized about 750 pieces of anti-slave trade legislation worldwide. A lot of this is sort of well documented. It's usually from the European perspective. This is when mixed commissions began to form, if you're familiar with this history. Emancipation, abolition happened at different periods. So we can use these timelines to really see the different heights and peaks and valleys within all of the legislation. It continued right up until sort of the late 19th century. I think this is sort of an underexplored facet within the abolition movement, sort of understanding the global transitions of anti-slavery legislation. While most of the stuff here is sort of the Eurocentric perspective, the British were also signing treaties along the African coast and with local leaders as well. So I think this ties in very greatly to some of the history that I'm talking about as well, since they're really sort of laying the foundation for colonialism within the continent. Engaging with a lot of local leaders, but really in this early first phase of it, they're really targeting areas around Freetown and the Gambia, as well as along the Arabian Peninsula. And then in the second period, here's just some examples of sort of what they look like. Some of the treaties, some of them are signed in Arabic, including along West Africa. So this all relates to sort of the jihadi movements that are occurring within West Africa as well. They really sort of wanted free and open commerce among anything else, ending the participation in the slave trade. They did so sort of in this gunboat diplomacy, saying if you don't sign it, then we'll come back and attack you, or if you don't abide by these rules. So it's really sort of laying the foundation of colonialism, and particularly they used liberated Africans who were not really freed, but forced into apprenticeships in a period that, Michael Zowski writes about a lot in terms of second slavery. So, in the second phase of this, you can really begin to see the massive amount of legislation that the British are signing with local rulers along the coast. They're coming back every 10 years or so, signing with the descendants of people, and really sort of imposing this abolition movement as sort of the continent shifts towards legitimate commerce. So as you can see, there's sort of this wide amount of information that's also available. We'll be able to, I do hope to sort of document all of the names of the local leaders and include them in this data set. Again, that can become another layer of data on West Africa Historical GIS. So again, the documents that I'm really working with are from the Sierra Leone Public Library Archives. These are a lot of the registers of liberated Africans. These will be data that can be uploaded into ships, which can be a layer on the maps as well that would appear on a temporal basis. We'd be able to sort of look at individual ships, and I can show you the template very soon on Yoruba Diaspora. This has, there's a lot of imagery associated with this movement as well, the capture of slave ships, among other things, burning of barracoons along the coast. You can begin to look at Freetown Harbor as well. I mean, these are all things that you can begin to associate on a temporal basis once you begin to layer in those maps. You know, here are some of the process that's painted from GIScience, which is on the Sierra Leone Peninsula, or other people liberated from ships that appear in sort of abolitionist propaganda that was emerging in the 19th century as well. You can see also from the Indian Ocean world, the captures of slave ship dhows. So this project, West Africa Historical GIS, is just sort of a starting point to a much broader effort to begin to map and plot what was happening internally within Africa in the pre-colonial period. So the registers of liberated Africans are incredibly detailed. We have these transliterated African names. So in many circumstances, we can understand the language of the name, even though it was written by a British person or a Spanish person, you know, who would hear someone's name and then try and write it in English or Spanish phonetics. A lot of information, say sex, age, and height, including physical descriptions, sometimes involving ethnic scarifications, brandings, among other things. And then as well as sort of this disposal category of where these people actually ended up. The registers, these are from Sierra Leone, about 82,000 people were registered. These have been transcribed mostly by David Eltis, among others from his team on Voyages, the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. The Cuban ones look a little different than the ones from Sierra Leone, only about 10,000 people here. But we get sort of information about the interpreters who are involved in the process. We have an African name again, a Christian name that was assigned to the people once they were unloaded in Havana. The Brazilian ones are a little bit different too. They don't have an African name, but sometimes they actually have sketches of brandings that are in there. My colleague, Katrina Kiefer, she's beginning a catalog of body markings so that we can begin to sort of understand ethnicity or slave ownership as well in different ways. So there's really sort of an infinite amount of information from this whole judicial process that was global in terms of the abolition movement, not only from the legislation side of things, but also from the people who were liberated from these slave ships and recaptured, in many circumstances resettled. Because of the camera, this is sort of some of the only images we actually have, photographs that we actually have of slave ships. So these are from East Africa, but you can sort of see the emaciated state of the people on board. So this movement is relatively small compared to the overall Atlantic slave trade. Just to sort of give you an idea of the graph, this top line is sort of the entire Atlantic slave trade, which sort of ends in 1867. And then the Indian Ocean slave trade continues a little bit longer. The red line is essentially all of the liberated Africans that I've been able to document and count up using Voyages, among other information as well. So here's just an information about sort of the registers of these people. So you can kind of see it's quite indicative of sort of the entire abolition movement. So we're talking about 100,000 people who had been registered out of the 225,000 people worldwide. So about half of liberated Africans were registered, which is quite phenomenal given the information available about the actual people in the slave trade. So where do they sort of come from? Where do they end up? We get about 50,000 in the Caribbean of liberated Africans. Again, these are sort of people who are called liberated Africans, but they're really not free. They're sort of recaptured from non-British ships and then forced into apprenticeships or indentured servitude. There's 20,000 in Brazil, another 24,000 end up in St. Helena. Depending on the differences of people, but eventually Portuguese, Spanish, they start sort of copying the British in this process. So in Angola, they end up liberating 170,000 people, the Portuguese, 50,000 in Mozambique. So it's a really sort of complicated global process that begins to shift as the legislation changes over the course of the 19th century, especially as other European powers sort of really begin to sort of get into backing the abolition movement to some degree. So what ends up happening to a lot of these people, particularly from Sierra Leone, St. Helena, and a lot in the Indian Ocean world, but is a lot of resettlement of liberated Africans. They don't just end up staying where they're liberated. So in fact, we can see that about 50,000 people out of the total were taken somewhere else. That basically means that they went all over the place. But really the big thing that began to happen is the resettlement of people from Sierra Leone and in particular St. Helena to the British Caribbean. So in total, the British essentially took people off of British and Spanish slave ships and then moved them into their own colonies as subjects. So in forced indentures, in forced apprenticeships, we can really begin. This also happens to the Seychelles, about 4,000 people. It's a little smaller in scale, but it certainly happened there too. It's a pretty even distribution relative to the size of a Caribbean island, but about 40,000 people if you begin to think about it. So I'm really beginning to argue now that the British didn't really withdraw from the slave trade in 1807, as many of us might argue. Because through the process of abolition, they actually moved over 50,000 people between 1831 and 1874. The last known ship to cross the Atlantic to Cuba was in 1867. So this might even extend a little bit the period of the transatlantic slave trade if you were to consider the British involvement in this process. So I think it's sort of a little bit disgusting to think about, and it might change how we conceptualize what is actually meant by abolition in this period. So of those resettled, we actually have a different set of registers of people. Some of them are very detailed, understanding, who the apprentices were, the people looking after these people, among other different things. You get these in Tortola, for example, through the Vice Admiralty Court from a ship that was captured in 1807, and then they tried to figure out where these people were in 1822. The same thing happened in Brazil. So they're using these scarifications and brandings to sort of re-identify people much later. The camera comes in East Africa. So we actually get sort of some of these photographs and registers of individuals there too. So again, it's sort of a much broader global movement that's happening. Lots of imagery related to sort of these resettlement of people. Here's some liberated Africans in the Gambia who were taken there from Sierra Leone. Most of these people ended up dying due to disease and other things. So it's quite a tragic story. Sometimes we get people, returnees coming back from the Americas. So in this case, there's emancipados from Cuba who ended up saving up about $25,000 or pesos in this period as a group. And in two excursions, they returned to their place in Africa by England because there were no direct ships going from Cuba to sort of back to Lagos. So there's lots of ways to follow these people around the Atlantic world. Here are some more in Jamaica, where they were given sort of these tin tag necklaces with a number on it. So again, very sort of indicative of slavery type practices. Many more were forced into the conscription, especially the West India Regiment. So they were really made into policing the Caribbean during this period as well. Others became missionaries, such as the very famous Samuel Ajayi Crowther, who was educated in Sierra Leone. His parents were liberated Africans, but then he became the first Black bishop of Africa in what is now Nigeria. Others became criminals. So here's some mugshots from Brazil of some liberated Africans. So really being able to connect a lot of these different people through the process of abolition is quite amazing, thanks to sort of computer technologies. Here is some enslavement in the Indian Ocean world, as well as some liberated Africans in St. Helena. So just as I begin to sort of wrap up a little bit, just returning to this before and after map, I've very much spoken about the external migrations of, and particularly of liberated Africans, that will certainly tie into those annual maps that I've been building. So my next phase is really to begin to focus on the Sokoto Caliphate. Because during this period, what we're really talking about is the age of revolutions, the rise of abolition in this period, as well as sort of the formation of these jihadi states in West Africa. This was such a huge defining moment in African history. It occurred intellectually, militarily, and economically. It really began in this region and then spread across the Sahel from the late 18th centuries into the 19th century. So it really coincided with the age of revolutions, the American, French, Haitian, Spanish-American Wars of Independence. But what was really happening in this period is it shaped the Atlantic world in a negative way, because most Muslims from these jihadi states refused to engage in the slave trade with Europeans at the coast. So there is this huge internalization of the African slave trade in this period too. It fits into the model of second slavery. And because of this prohibition, all of the slave trade really went internally. So when we're talking about the formation of the Sokoto Caliphate, and there's all of this evidence of people leaving the coast, we're really talking about a massive migration internally into Sokoto as well, coming from the Oyo region. So this is really sort of the beginning to understanding more internal migrations and slave trades. So looking back at this sort of map, I'm going to be targeting really the central Savannah region as a next step to be able to sort of reverse engineer how the probabilities of migrations will work and apply them internally as well. So we'll be able to learn a lot more about Africa internally. This is really important because we also have a lot of imagery related to this. Here are some of the Mandingos or other Muslims who would have been involved in these jihads, who would have been supportive of them, who wouldn't have wanted to trade with Europeans at the coast. So we can begin to associate these imagery to specific places and periods, including the warfare that would have happened, the size of some of these cities in these periods, the archaeological findings, old city walls that certainly existed. Because with all of these enslaved people who went internally, we're talking about the same size of an enslaved population as all of the Americas combined. So we're talking United States, Brazil, Cuba, the Caribbean. That's how many enslaved people would have been in and around these jihadi states. So what were they doing exactly? Very much like what the British were. They were producing textiles, agriculture, among other things. Textiles was probably the biggest. A place like Sokoto Caliphate was probably clothing most of West Africa parts of the Sahara and parts of North Africa during this period. So the textile productions were really, really huge. Here are some fortifications and some of the towns that they would have built. So again, conflict becomes a very big part of this equation, understanding that enslavement usually happens with conflict. So wherever there was warfare, expanding territories, we could likely guess that there's going to be the enslavement of people from particular places. So here's the old central mosque in Kano. It's since been torn down. And here are just sort of some modern day dye pits for the textile industry in Kano. These really were, you can think of them as factories in the same sense as the European ones in the Industrial Revolution. The only difference is that there's just not a roof on top. But it's essentially the same sort of scale. We're talking about textile factories with 15,000 plus workers, multiple of these around different cities and areas. So it was such a massive industry. Here are sort of some of the textiles that would have been produced and during this period. So just to sort of summarize, West Africa Historical GIS, I think is just a new way that I'm envisioning how we can archive different types of information based on a cartographic representations. So currently right now, I'm working with a new company called Walk with Web. I've sort of helped co-found it because of the difficulties of the digital humanities, finding money, sustainability, getting universities fully on board. So this company is sort of independent from all of that, but a large proportion, percentages of our grant monies pay for it. So we have multiple projects that are sort of hinged around this one company where we can begin to use that data to layer in different ways. We're collaborating, we're working together to really pull in this information. So the West Africa Historical GIS is really about generating new data to show these transformations, these spatial transformations over time. But other scholars, of course, are working on lots of information because we can plot slave ships on an annual basis. We can plot the migrations of individuals based on their slave narratives over space and time. You know, the legislation, these are all things that we can begin to put onto different types of maps, as well as uprisings or the continuation of warfare among enslaved people in the Americas, which might have a direct correlation to some of these migrations as well. So there's really a lot that's really exciting and new that can begin happening with maps. And I hope I sort of made it simple, but also made the problem much more complicated. So I will sort of end there, and I'd be happy to hear some questions and some discussions or anything else that you guys might want to add.